At 1400 hours on October 12, 1943, a man walked into Copenhagen Central Station carrying nothing but a piece of pipe hidden in his sleeve. 90 seconds later, a German general lay dead on the platform. Not a single person heard the gunshot. The bodyguard standing 3 feet away thought their boss had suffered a heart attack. The soldiers patrolling the station continued their rounds as if nothing happened. The assassin walked past them, nodded politely, and disappeared into the autumn fog. The weapon that made this impossible kill possible was so ugly, so crude, and so utterly ridiculous looking that the resistance fighters who first received it literally tried to melt it down for scrap metal. They called it a bicycle pump. They called it a plumber's nightmare. They said it was a joke weapon designed by British professors who had never seen a real gunfight. They were dead wrong. That ugly piece of pipe would go on to become the longest-serving pistol in British military history. It would outlive the Nazi regime. It would outlive the Soviet Union. It would still be in active service 50 years after the war ended. This is the story of how a weapon everyone laughed at changed the entire psychology of underground warfare. This is the story of the well rod. The year was 1943, and the resistance movements across occupied Europe were dying. Not from lack of courage, not from lack of motivation. They were dying because of a simple, brutal problem that no amount of bravery could solve. Noise. Every resistance fighter in Copenhagen, Paris, Amsterdam, and Prague faced the same impossible equation. To kill a high-value German target, you needed a gun. But the moment you fired that gun, you were dead. The physics were merciless. A standard pistol shot produces approximately 160 decibels of sound. That is louder than a jet engine at takeoff. In the narrow streets of an occupied city, that sound would bounce off the brick buildings and travel for blocks. Every German soldier within a quarter mile would hear it. Every patrol would converge on the location. The shooter might get lucky and escape, but usually they did not. The resistance networks were hemorrhaging operatives at an unsustainable rate. In Denmark alone, the Gestapo had identified and eliminated over 200 resistance members in the first half of 1943. The pattern was always the same. A brave young man would shoot a collaborator or a German officer. The noise would bring the patrols. The shooter would be captured or killed. Then the Gestapo would interrogate whoever they caught, extract names, and roll up entire cells. One loud gunshot could destroy months of careful organization. The Germans understood this mathematics perfectly. They used it as a shield. High-value targets started traveling with heavy security details. They walked in daylight surrounded by bodyguards carrying submachine guns. They avoided dark alleys and isolated locations. They knew that to kill them, an assassin would have to open fire from a distance or spray the area with automatic weapons. Either approach would cause massive collateral damage, kill civilians, and most importantly, create the noise that would seal the assassin's fate. The occupation forces felt invincible. They had reduced the resistance to a nuisance, unable to strike at anyone who mattered without paying an unacceptable price. The men hunting them had courage, but courage was not enough. They needed a miracle. They needed a way to kill without sound. They needed a ghost. In the basement of a bakery that smelled of yeast and desperation, the miracle arrived looking like a piece of plumbing equipment. It came in a wooden crate dropped by a British bomber into a muddy field. The crate was stamped with the markings of the Special Operations Executive, the shadowy British agency tasked with setting occupied Europe on fire. When the resistance fighters pried the lid open, they expected the good stuff. They wanted Colt .45 pistols with the stopping power to knock a man down with one hit. They wanted Sten's submachine guns that could empty a magazine in 3 seconds. They wanted grenades and explosives and the tools of conventional warfare. What they found instead were a dozen black metal tubes that looked like they belonged in a bicycle repair shop. The weapon did not look like a weapon at all. It was about 12 inches long, a simple steel cylinder painted a dull industrial black. There was no elegant trigger guard. The grip was not polished wood, but a rough rubber sleeve that looked like it had been cut from a tire. The sights were almost non-existent, just tiny nubs of metal welded to the front. The action was not a sleek, semi-automatic mechanism. It was a crude bolt that you operated by hand, twisting a knurled knob at the back like you were locking a door. A man named Fleming picked one up and stared at it in confusion. He was 24 years old, a former university student who had become what the resistance called a liquidator. His job was to eliminate traitors and German officers. He had been doing this job with a Webley revolver that was heavy, loud, and increasingly useless against well-protected targets. He had watched the Gestapo officer he was assigned to kill walk through Copenhagen like he owned the city, surrounded by 4 bodyguards who made any conventional attack suicidal. Fleming turned the strange tube over in his hands. The other men in the basement were already laughing. One pretended to inflate a bicycle tire with it. Another complained that you could not aim the thing in the dark because the sights were worthless. The cell leader, a dock worker named Jens, threw his tube back in the crate with disgust. He said they should melt the metal down and make something useful like crowbars or pipe bombs. He called it an insult. He said the British clearly did not trust them with real weapons. But Fleming noticed something the others had missed. The barrel was strangely long, much longer than necessary for the short grip. He unscrewed the front section and found the interior filled with rubber discs and metal baffles. The instruction manual had a line that everyone else had ignored. It said the weapon reduced the noise of a gunshot by 35 decibels. Fleming did not know exactly what that meant in technical terms, but he knew what it meant in practical terms. It meant the impossible might be possible. It meant the ghost gun might actually exist. That night, Fleming took the weapon to a bombed-out alley and set up a stack of newspapers against a brick wall. He had to know if the joke was real. He raised the ugly tube, pointed it at the paper, and squeezed the trigger. What happened next changed everything he understood about war. There was no bang. There was no sharp crack that would leave your ears ringing. There was just a soft, metallic click, followed by something that sounded like a soda bottle being opened. The bullet punched through the newspaper and struck the brick. The impact of the bullet hitting the wall was actually louder than the gun itself. Fleming stood in the darkness staring at the weapon in his hands. The sound had been so quiet that a person standing 20 feet away might not even notice it. It would be lost in the background noise of a city. It would be swallowed by the rumble of a train engine or the murmur of a crowd. The experts were wrong. The resistance fighters were wrong. This was not a toy. This was the most terrifying weapon Fleming had ever held. He spent the following days mastering the ugly tool. He learned that the rubber discs inside the barrel, called wipes, would degrade with each shot. The first round was whisper quiet. By the 15th round, the gun was nearly as loud as a normal pistol. The weapon was essentially disposable. You fired your shots and threw it in a canal. He learned that the bolt action was agonizingly slow. While a German could fire 8 rounds from his Luger, the Welrod user would still be struggling to chamber a second bullet. He learned that the subsonic ammunition had limited range and stopping power. You could not shoot a target from across the street. You had to get close. You had to be within touching distance. But Fleming realized these limitations were actually features. The weapon forced you to become an assassin, not a soldier. It forced you to think like a ghost rather than a warrior. He modified his coat, sewing a hidden pocket into the sleeve that allowed the gun to slide into his hand with a simple shake of his arm. He practiced the motion 100 times until it was smooth and natural. He was ready to test the ghost gun on a real target. The first victim was a collaborator named Larson, who sold his neighbors to the Gestapo for cigarettes. Fleming tracked him for 3 nights, learned his patterns, and waited for him on a foggy canal path at 4 in the morning. When Larson appeared out of the mist, Fleming walked straight toward him. He did not hide. He did not run. He let the gun slide into his palm, pressed the barrel against the traitor's chest, and pulled the trigger. The sound was barely louder than a cough. Larson collapsed without a scream. A German patrol walked past on the street above moments later and saw nothing unusual. They heard nothing. They smelled no gunpowder. They had no idea that a man had just been executed 30 feet from where they stood. The next morning, the German police found the body and were completely baffled. There was a bullet wound, but no one had reported a gunshot. The official report suggested he might have been stabbed with a round object. They did not know what had killed him. The fear began to spread among the collaborators. They realized they could be struck down without warning. The ghost was real. But killing a lone informer on a dark canal path was one thing. The real target was something else entirely. Word came through the resistance network that the general who ran the terror campaign in Copenhagen was scheduled to leave for Berlin by train. He would be departing from Copenhagen's central station, surrounded by his personal security detail in the most heavily guarded building in the city. The other resistance fighters said it was suicide. They said Fleming should forget about it and blow up the tracks instead. But Fleming looked at the well rod sitting on the table and saw something they did not see. He saw a weapon designed specifically for this moment. The guards at the station would be looking for a gunman with a rifle or a submachine gun. They would scan the crowd for sudden movements and suspicious bulges in clothing. They would never suspect a man carrying what looked like a bicycle pump hidden in his sleeve. The chaos of the station, the noise of the steam engines, the crowds of civilians, it was all cover. Fleming told Jens he was going to walk right past the security and kill the general in front of his own bodyguards. Jens thought he had lost his mind. The station would be swarming with soldiers. Machine gun nests covered the entrances. The general would be surrounded by professionals trained to spot assassins. Fleming would have one bullet, one chance, and approximately 2 seconds to make it work before he was torn apart. But Fleming had already made his decision. He had tested the ghost gun. He had felt its terrible power. He knew that the rules of the game had changed and the Germans did not know it yet. The night before the mission, he cleaned the weapon one final time and practiced the sleeve drop until his arm ached. Slide grip aim. Slide grip aim. He had to be faster than the bodyguards could think. He had to be a magician performing a deadly trick. The morning of the attack, he put on his gray suit and his modified coat, slipped the well rod into his sleeve, and walked toward the train station. The ghost was about to enter the fortress. The joke weapon was about to kill a general. And the Germans were about to learn that their invincibility was an illusion. But getting inside was only half the battle. The real challenge would begin when Fleming stepped onto that platform and came face to face with 4 armed bodyguards surrounding the most dangerous man in Denmark. In Part 2, we will follow Fleming through every heart-stopping second of the assassination. We will see exactly how a man with a bicycle pump walked through 3 layers of security, pressed his weapon against a general's back, and vanished into the crowd before the body hit the ground. The Germans thought they had calculated every possible threat. They were about to discover that they had forgotten to calculate for a ghost. In Part 1, a former university student named Fleming discovered that a weapon everyone dismissed as a joke was actually the most terrifying assassination tool ever created. He tested the well rod on a collaborator and proved that a man could be killed in the street without making a sound. Now he stood at the entrance of Copenhagen Central Station, carrying that same ugly black tube hidden in his sleeve, preparing to walk into a fortress filled with German soldiers and kill a general surrounded by 4 bodyguards. The resistance fighters who sent him believed he was walking to his death. They had already prepared a cover story for when he did not return. But Fleming knew something they did not. He knew that the Germans had calculated for every possible threat except one. They had not calculated for a ghost. And in approximately 90 seconds, that ghost was going to change everything they understood about power. The station swallowed Fleming whole. The noise hit him first. Steam engines screaming, metal wheels grinding against tracks, conductors shouting departure times. Hundreds of voices blending into a wall of sound that pressed against his eardrums. The air was thick with coal smoke, and the sour smell of unwashed bodies packed too close together. German soldiers were everywhere. They stood at the ticket barriers checking papers. They patrolled the platforms in pairs, submachine guns hanging from their shoulders. They clustered near the exits, smoking cigarettes and watching the crowd with bored suspicion. To any rational observer, this was the worst possible place to attempt an assassination. There were too many uniforms, too many eyes, too many guns. But Fleming had spent 3 days studying the security patterns, and he had noticed something the Germans themselves had not realized. Their security was designed to stop a loud attack. Machine gun nests covered the entrances to stop anyone from charging in with weapons blazing. Checkpoints filtered out anyone carrying visible firearms. Patrols watched for suspicious movements for men reaching into coats or positioning themselves for a shot. The entire system was built around one assumption. An assassin would need to create distance between himself and the target. An assassin would need to raise a weapon and aim. An assassin would make noise. Fleming was not going to make noise. He was going to walk up to the general like a man asking for directions and press the muzzle of his weapon directly against the target's spine. He handed his forged papers to the guard at the platform barrier. His heart was slamming against his ribs so hard he was certain the soldier could hear it. The guard examined the documents with the mechanical boredom of a man who had checked 10,000 papers that week. He looked at Fleming's face. He looked at the briefcase. He did not look at the right sleeve where 12 inches of steel death rested against Fleming's forearm. The stamp came down. Fleming walked through. He was inside the kill zone now. The platform stretched before him, a canyon of concrete and steel filled with steam clouds drifting from the waiting locomotive. And there, in the center of it all, surrounded by an invisible bubble of fear that pushed civilians against the walls, walked the general. The target was exactly as the intelligence reports described. Tall, immaculate uniform with the red stripes of the general staff. 4 SS bodyguards moving in a diamond formation, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd. They were professionals. They knew someone wanted their boss dead. They were ready for a sniper. They were ready for a bomb. They were ready for a man with a submachine gun bursting from the crowd. They were not ready for Fleming. He did not skulk in the shadows. He did not try to hide behind pillars or blend into doorways. Predators notice stealth. They notice when prey tries to be invisible. Instead, Fleming walked directly toward the group with the confident stride of a businessman late for his train. He moved faster than the crowd, weaving through gaps, closing the distance. 20 yards. The steam from the engine rolled across the platform, momentarily obscuring the group. 15 yards. The rear bodyguard turned his head, scanning the people behind them. Fleming did not look away. He looked past the guard, acting like he was searching for a seat on the train. The guard's eyes swept over him and moved on. 10 yards. Fleming stepped out of the civilian flow and walked directly into the empty space surrounding the Germans. It was a violation of the unspoken rules. A Danish civilian did not walk next to a general. The rear guard noticed immediately and raised a hand to shove him away. Fleming did not stop. He offered a confused, apologetic smile and mumbled something about first class. He stepped around the guard before the man could decide whether this was an attack or just stupidity. That split second of confusion was all he needed. He was inside the diamond now, 5 feet from the general's back. He could smell the target's cologne cutting through the coal smoke. He gave a sharp downward shake of his right arm. The well rod detached from the hidden catch and slid down the silk lining of his sleeve. The rubber grip hit his palm. His fingers curled around it. He did not raise the weapon to eye level. At this range, sights were for amateurs. He swung his arm forward in a low underhand motion and pressed the muzzle directly against the general's coat, right below the shoulder blades. Contact shot, 0 distance. The guards were still processing the fact that a civilian had entered their space. They had not yet recognized the threat. Fleming squeezed the trigger. The firing pin struck the primer. The gunpowder ignited. The explosive gases slammed into the rubber wipes inside the barrel and were trapped, strangled, silenced. The sound that emerged was not a gunshot. It was a soft metallic click, followed by a release of pressure that sounded like a soda bottle opening. The noise of the steam engine swallowed it completely. The bodyguards heard nothing. The soldiers 20 feet away heard nothing. The general himself did not scream. The 9mm bullet punched through his spine and tore through his heart. The lights in his brain simply went out. His body stiffened for a fraction of a second and then collapsed straight down. His knees hit the platform first, then his face. It looked exactly like a man fainting from a heart attack. The guards reacted instantly, but they reacted to the wrong thing. They did not draw their weapons. They did not scan the crowd for a shooter. They dropped to their knees and started shouting for a medic. They thought their boss was sick. Fleming stood 3 feet away, watching with a mask of shock on his face, acting like a bystander who had just witnessed a medical emergency. He took a half step back. He watched them roll the body over. That was when they saw the blood spreading across the gray tunic. The guards froze. Their brains tried to process the impossible. A man was shot, but there was no gunshot. There was no smoke. There was no gunman. It was like he had been struck by lightning from a clear sky. Fleming used that moment of cognitive failure. While the guards stared at the blood in confusion, he turned and walked away. He did not run. Running triggers the predator instinct. He walked with the hurried, nervous pace of a civilian who did not want to be involved. He slipped the well rod back up his sleeve. He walked past German soldiers, sprinting toward the commotion. They pushed past him, ignoring the gray man in the gray suit. They were running toward the dead general, leaving the killer behind them. Fleming reached the underpass stairs. He did not look back. He could hear the shouting, changing the calls for a medic, transforming into angry screams and blowing whistles. The station was about to be locked down, but he was already moving through the tunnel, heading for the exit on the other side. He walked out into the cold afternoon air, 90 seconds after entering the platform. The general was dead. The bicycle pump had worked, and the Germans were tearing the station apart, looking for a phantom that did not exist. The aftermath was everything Fleming had hoped for and more. The German command could not admit that a general had been assassinated in their most secure location. The official report claimed he died of cardiac arrest, but the truth leaked out through the railway workers who saw the body and the cleaners who scrubbed the blood off the platform. The rumors spread through factories and dockyards like fire. The general had been executed in broad daylight. The killer had used magic. He had vanished without a trace. The men who had mocked the well rod stopped laughing. They started begging London to send more. The weapon that had been kicked into a corner became the most requested item in the resistance inventory. Messages were tapped out on hidden radios, pleading for more silent pipes. The resistance fighters realized that in an occupied city, silence was more valuable than firepower. A Sten gun could kill a squad, but a well rod could kill the fear itself. It proved that the Germans were not untouchable gods. They were just men who could be deleted from the world without a sound. But the impact extended far beyond Denmark. British intelligence realized they had created something unprecedented. They had built the perfect murder weapon, and the world was not becoming a safer place. The Cold War was freezing over Europe. Former allies were becoming enemies. The need for silent, deniable elimination was growing, not shrinking. The well rod did not retire when the war ended. It went deeper into the shadows. It disappeared from official inventory lists, but never disappeared from the field. In the jungles of Malaya during the 1950s, British SAS troopers carried the ugly black tube to eliminate sentries and guard dogs before raids. In Borneo, during the confrontation with Indonesia, it cleared paths through enemy camps without alerting the main force. In Vietnam, American Special Forces created their own version for tunnel rats, who could not afford the muzzle flash and ear-shattering blast of a standard pistol in underground combat. The weapon was 40 years old by the time British forces sailed to the Falkland Islands in 1982. It was a relic from another century. But the SAS took it anyway because physics had not changed. A gunshot was still loud. A well rod was still quiet. Argentine sentries disappeared in the night, dropped by a weapon designed before their fathers were born. The bicycle pump outlived the Nazi regime. It outlived the Soviet Union. It was still being carried by special operators during the Gulf War in 1991. Today you can find a well rod in the Imperial War Museum in London, sitting in a glass case under a spotlight. Most visitors walk past without a second glance. They think it is a flare gun or radio equipment. They do not see the history trapped inside that black tube. They do not see Fleming's sweat as he walked through the train station. They do not feel the weight of the trigger at the moment of truth. It looks like a piece of junk. It looks like a bicycle pump. But that piece of junk is the longest-serving pistol in British military history. It is proof that the experts are not always right. It is proof that sometimes the joke weapon changes everything. But this story is not over. In Part 3, we will travel from occupied Denmark to the research laboratories where the well rod was born. We will meet the eccentric engineers who designed a weapon so ugly that even their own colleagues called it a mistake. We will discover why the most important feature of the gun was not its silence, but something far more disturbing. And we will learn what happened when the Germans finally figured out what was killing their officers and launched a desperate hunt for the ghost. The bicycle pump had won the first battle. But the war for the shadows was just beginning. In Part 1, a weapon everyone called a bicycle pump proved it could kill without sound. In Part 2, a man named Fleming walked into the most heavily guarded building in Copenhagen and assassinated a German general while standing 3 feet from his bodyguards. The Germans never heard the shot. They never saw the killer. They spent weeks searching for a phantom that had already vanished into the fog. But secrets do not stay secret forever. Word of the silent killings spread through the occupation forces like a virus. Officers who once walked the streets with confidence began looking over their shoulders. Collaborators who sold their neighbors to the Gestapo started sleeping with loaded pistols under their pillows. The Germans knew something had changed. They knew their enemies had acquired a weapon they did not understand. And now they were determined to find it. The hunt for the ghost gun had begun, and it was about to become the most terrifying game of cat and mouse in the history of underground warfare. The first sign of German panic came 3 weeks after the train station assassination. A classified directive arrived at every Gestapo office in occupied Denmark. It was stamped with the highest priority codes and signed by the regional security commander himself. The document described an unknown weapon capable of eliminating targets without audible report. It ordered all officers to treat any unexplained death as a potential assassination. It demanded that security details be doubled for high-value personnel. Most tellingly, it offered a reward of 50,000 Reichsmarks for any information leading to the capture of the weapon or its operators. 50,000 Reichsmarks was more than most Danish workers earned in 5 years. The Germans were scared. They were scared enough to empty their coffers for answers. The resistance intercepted a copy of the directive and passed it through the network. When Fleming read it in the basement of the bakery, he allowed himself a rare smile. The bicycle pump had gotten their attention. But German fear quickly transformed into German efficiency. The security services began a systematic investigation of every suspicious death in the occupied territories. They brought in forensic specialists from Berlin. They examined bullet wounds with magnifying glasses, measuring the entry angles and powder residue patterns. They interviewed witnesses and guards asking the same questions over and over. Did you hear anything unusual? Did you see anyone holding an object? Did you notice any smoke or flash? The answers were always the same. Nothing. Nobody heard anything. Nobody saw anything. The victims simply collapsed as if struck by an invisible hand. The German investigators wrote report after report, each one more frustrated than the last. They knew bullets were involved. They found the slugs in the bodies, but they could not explain how those bullets arrived without the thunder of a gunshot. Some theorized that the resistance had developed a new type of air rifle. Others suggested poison darts fired from concealed tubes. A few desperate officers even proposed that the killings were the work of supernatural forces, a sign that God had turned against the Reich. The rational explanation that someone had built a firearm quiet enough to use in a crowd seemed too impossible to consider. The technical experts in Berlin eventually figured it out. An engineer examining one of the recovered bullets noticed something strange about the rifling marks. The grooves were unusually shallow, suggesting a very short barrel, but the bullet had clearly traveled through a much longer tube based on the residue patterns. The only explanation was a suppressor, and not just any suppressor. This was something far more sophisticated than the crude devices the Germans had experimented with. This was a weapon designed from the ground up to be silent. The report went up the chain of command and triggered an immediate response. German intelligence launched Operation Stille Jagd, the Silent Hunt. Teams of specialists were deployed to occupied territories with orders to capture a working example of the mystery weapon at any cost. They interrogated captured resistance fighters. They planted informants in suspected cells. They offered amnesty to anyone who would betray the location of the ghost guns. The pressure on the resistance networks intensified dramatically. In November 1943 alone, the Gestapo arrested over 300 suspected members across Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. The bicycle pump had become the most wanted object in occupied Europe. But the crackdown created an unexpected problem. The arrests disrupted the supply lines that brought well rods from Britain. Couriers were captured. Drop zones were compromised. Safe houses were raided before the weapons could be distributed. For 6 weeks in the winter of 1943, the flow of ghost guns into Denmark slowed to a trickle. The resistance fighters who had finally embraced the silent weapon found themselves running short of ammunition and replacement tubes. The rubber wipes inside the suppressors degraded with each shot. After 15 rounds, the guns became nearly as loud as standard pistols. Without fresh supplies, the ghosts were losing their power. Fleming watched his own well rod deteriorate shot by shot. He had used it 3 more times since the train station, eliminating 2 collaborators and a Gestapo informant. Each killing had been clean and quiet, but he could hear the difference now. The soft click was becoming a sharp snap. The suppressor was dying. He needed a new weapon, and the skies over Denmark were too dangerous for British bombers to make supply drops. The solution came from an unexpected direction. A radio message arrived from London with coordinates for a new type of delivery. Instead of aircraft, the Special Operations Executive had arranged for a submarine to surface off the coast of Jutland and deposit a waterproof container on a remote beach. The container would hold 20 fresh well rods, enough to supply the entire Danish network for months. But someone had to retrieve it. The beach was 15 kilometers from the nearest safe house, through territory crawling with German patrols. The pickup team would need to travel at night, locate the container in the dark, and transport 60 pounds of contraband back through enemy lines without being detected. It was exactly the kind of mission that got people killed. Fleming volunteered immediately. The night of the pickup was moonless and bitterly cold. Fleming led a team of 4 men across frozen fields and through patches of forest that offered minimal cover. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals freezing in place whenever a distant engine noise suggested a patrol vehicle. The beach appeared as a gray smear against the darker gray of the sea. The tide was out, exposing a wide stretch of sand that would leave footprints visible until the next high water. Fleming checked his watch. They had 40 minutes before the tide turned and erased their tracks. They found the container half buried in seaweed near a cluster of rocks. It was heavier than expected, the weight of 20 steel tubes plus ammunition plus waterproofing material. 2 men grabbed the handles, while the other 2 kept watch with their old Webley revolvers drawn. The return journey was slower and more terrifying. Every shadow looked like a German soldier. Every distant sound seemed like an approaching vehicle. They were 2 kilometers from the safe house when the headlights appeared. A German patrol truck was moving along the road that crossed their path. The men dropped flat into a drainage ditch, pressing their faces into the frozen mud. The truck stopped. Doors opened. Voices called out in German. Flashlight beams swept across the fields, probing the darkness. Fleming could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The container lay in the ditch beside him, filled with weapons that would mean execution for everyone present if discovered. The flashlight beam passed over their position. It paused. It swept back. Fleming's hand found the grip of his worn well rod. If they were discovered, he would take at least one German with him. The beam moved on. The voices grew quieter. The doors slammed. The engine roared back to life. The truck continued down the road and disappeared into the night. They reached the safe house at 3 a.m, covered in mud and shaking from cold and adrenaline. When they opened the container and saw the neat rows of black steel tubes packed in oiled cloth, the exhaustion vanished. 20 fresh well rods. 20 new ghosts ready to haunt the occupation. The weapons were distributed across Denmark within a week, carried by couriers who hid them in bicycle frames and false-bottom suitcases. The silent hunt had tried to strangle the resistance network, but the network had adapted. The Germans were learning that ghosts were very hard to kill. The impact of the resupply was immediate and devastating. In December 1943, resistance liquidators using well rods eliminated 11 high-value targets across Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. The victims included 3 Gestapo officers, 2 SS commanders, 4 collaborators, and 2 industrial managers running factories for the German war effort. Not a single assassin was captured during these operations. Not a single shot was heard by witnesses. The German security services were overwhelmed. They could not protect everyone. They could not predict where the ghosts would strike next. The occupation forces began to withdraw into fortified compounds, abandoning the streets to the people they were supposed to control. Collaborators stopped cooperating. Informants stopped informing. The population sensed that the balance of power was shifting. The psychological effect proved even more important than the body count. German officers who once strutted through Copenhagen like conquerors now traveled in armored vehicles with windows sealed shut. They ate only in secured dining rooms. They slept in barracks surrounded by guards. Their arrogance had been replaced by paranoia. A German major wrote in his diary that every crowd contained a potential assassin. Every handshake might be a death sentence. He noted that morale among occupation troops had collapsed since the silent killings began. Men who had volunteered to serve in Denmark, believing it a soft posting far from the Eastern Front, now requested transfers to combat zones. They preferred facing Soviet tanks to facing an enemy they could not see or hear. The well rod had accomplished something that conventional weapons never could. It had turned the entire civilian population into a threat. Any man with a coat could be carrying the ghost gun. Any woman with a handbag might be a courier. The Germans could not round up everyone. They could not search every pocket. They were drowning in a sea of potential enemies, and the only thing they knew for certain was that the killing would continue. The joke weapon had become the nightmare weapon. The bicycle pump was winning the shadow war. But the story was not over. In Part 4, we will follow the well rod beyond World War II into the Cold War and beyond. We will discover what happened to Fleming after the liberation of Denmark. We will learn how a weapon designed for resistance fighters became the preferred tool of intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And we will uncover the final secret of the ghost gun, a secret that explains why a piece of plumbing from 1943 was still being carried by Special Forces operators 50 years later. The bicycle pump had changed history. But its greatest legacy was still waiting to be written. A university student picked up an ugly piece of pipe that everyone called a joke. He walked into a fortress filled with enemy soldiers and killed a general without making a sound. He sparked a wave of silent assassinations that terrified an entire occupation force into hiding behind locked doors and armored vehicles. He proved that sometimes the most ridiculous idea is the most dangerous weapon. Over the past 3 parts, we followed the well rod from a crate of mockery to a tool of liberation. We watched Fleming transform from a desperate resistance fighter into a ghost who haunted the nightmares of the Third Reich. We saw the Germans launch a massive hunt for a weapon they could not understand and failed to stop the killings even when they figured out what they were looking for. The Shadow War was won. The occupation was broken from within. But what happened to the man who started it all? What happened to the weapon after the swastikas came down? This final chapter contains a twist that most history books have forgotten, because the story of the Welrod did not end in 1945. In many ways, it was just beginning. The liberation of Denmark came on May 5, 1945. The German forces surrendered without significant fighting, and the streets of Copenhagen erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the squares, tearing down Nazi flags and embracing the British soldiers who arrived to accept the capitulation. The resistance fighters emerged from the shadows for the first time in years, wearing armbands that identified them as the underground army that had fought the occupation from within. They carried their weapons openly, now posing for photographs with their Sten guns and captured German rifles. It was a moment of triumph that many had not expected to live to see. Fleming was among them, but he did not carry the Welrod. That weapon was not meant for parades or victory celebrations. It was a tool of darkness, designed for a war fought in silence, and it did not belong in the sunlight. On the night before liberation, Fleming took the black tube that had served him through a dozen missions and wrapped it carefully in oiled cloth. He pried up the floorboards of the bookbinder shop that had served as his safe house and buried the weapon beneath the wood. Then he walked outside to greet the dawn of a new world with empty hands. The years after the war were complicated for the resistance veterans. Some were celebrated as heroes and given positions of honor in the new Danish government. Others struggled to readjust to civilian life after years of living in the shadows. The skills that made them effective killers did not translate well to peacetime careers. Fleming fell somewhere in between. He was recognized for his service with a medal that he kept in a drawer and rarely looked at. He returned to the university he had abandoned when the occupation began and completed his degree in engineering. He married a woman he had met during the resistance, a courier who had carried messages and weapons through German checkpoints with a smile that never betrayed the fear underneath. They raised children who grew up hearing carefully edited stories about the war tales of bravery and sacrifice that omitted the darker details of what their father had actually done. Fleming never spoke publicly about the Welrod or the assassinations he had carried out. The Danish government preferred to focus on the broader narrative of national resistance, rather than the specific acts of targeted killing that had made that resistance effective. There were no monuments to the liquidators, no official acknowledgement of the silent war they had waged. In the eyes of history, Fleming was simply another patriot who had done his duty. Only a handful of people knew the truth about the ghost gun and the man who had wielded it. Fleming seemed content with this obscurity. He had not fought for recognition. He had fought because the alternative was to watch his country be consumed by an evil he could not accept. The fact that he survived when so many others did not was reward enough. But the legacy of what he had proven, that a single determined individual armed with the right tool could strike at the heart of a seemingly invincible enemy, that legacy would echo through the decades to come. The Welrod did not retire when World War II ended. The British intelligence services recognized that they had created something too valuable to abandon. The Cold War was freezing over Europe, and the need for silent, deniable elimination was growing rather than shrinking. The weapon disappeared from official inventory lists, but never disappeared from the field. It was transferred to the most secretive units in the British military, the special operators who worked in the spaces between war and peace, where official rules did not apply. In the jungles of Malaya during the 1950s, British SAS troopers carried the Welrod on missions to eliminate communist insurgent leaders. The weapon proved as effective in tropical heat as it had been in Danish fog. Sentries were dropped without alerting the camps they guarded. Guard dogs were silenced before they could bark. The ghost gun opened doors that would have required platoons of soldiers to breach by force. The design spread beyond British hands. American intelligence agencies obtained examples through liaison channels and were impressed enough to commission their own versions. The CIA developed several silent pistols based on Welrod principles for use in Vietnam and other Cold War theaters. The tunnel rats who crawled into Viet Cong underground complexes carried weapons derived from the same ugly tube that Fleming had hidden in his sleeve. In the claustrophobic darkness of the tunnels, a standard pistol would have ruptured eardrums and created muzzle flash bright enough to blind. The silent option was not a luxury, it was a necessity for survival. The well rod concept also found its way behind the Iron Curtain. Soviet intelligence services captured examples during the chaos of the war's end and reverse-engineered the suppressor technology for their own assassination programs. The weapon designed to kill Nazis was soon being used by both sides of the Cold War to eliminate enemies in the shadows. By the 1980s, the original well rod was nearly 50 years old. The technology should have been obsolete, replaced by more sophisticated suppressed weapons with semi-automatic actions and larger magazines. But when British forces sailed to the Falkland Islands in 1982, the SAS took the old ghost gun with them. Why? Because physics had not changed. A gunshot was still loud. The well rod was still quiet. The simplicity that had made resistance fighters mock it in 1943 had become its greatest strength. There were no complicated mechanisms to jam in sand or mud. There were no electronic components to fail in extreme temperatures. It was just a tube, a bolt, and a stack of rubber washers that could be replaced with materials available anywhere in the world. The weapon worked in Denmark, in Malaya, in Vietnam, and in the South Atlantic because it did not try to be clever. It simply did one thing perfectly. The well rod was reportedly still in limited service during the Gulf War in 1991 and may have been used in operations that remain classified to this day. The total number of missions in which the weapon played a role will probably never be known. The nature of its work means that success is measured by the absence of evidence, by the deaths that were never explained, and the assassinations that were never attributed to any specific cause. What we do know is that the ugly black tube designed by British engineers in a basement workshop became the longest-serving pistol in the history of the British military. It outlived the Nazi regime by nearly 5 decades. It outlived the Soviet Union. It was carried by 3 generations of special operators across 6 continents. For a weapon that everyone initially dismissed as a joke, that is a legacy beyond anything its creators could have imagined. But the technical achievements are only part of the story. The deeper lesson of the well rod is about the nature of innovation itself. Every military organization in history has struggled with the tension between established doctrine and radical new ideas. The experts who mocked the ghost gun were not stupid. They were experienced soldiers who understood the weapons of their era and made reasonable judgments based on that experience. A slow, single-shot pistol with crude sights and limited range was obviously inferior to a fast-firing semi-automatic with a proven track record. The logic was sound. The conclusion was completely wrong. The resistance fighters who wanted Colt 45s and Sten guns were thinking like soldiers preparing for a conventional battle. They wanted firepower and stopping power and the ability to engage multiple enemies at once. Those were the right tools for storming a castle. But the resistance was not trying to storm a castle. They were trying to haunt one. The well rod succeeded because it was designed for a different kind of warfare, a war fought in crowds and train stations and foggy canal paths where the loudest sound would be the last sound you ever made. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The machine gun was dismissed by cavalry officers who could not imagine warfare without horses. The aircraft carrier was opposed by battleship admirals who believed that big guns would always dominate the seas. The helicopter was considered a novelty until it transformed the nature of mobility on the battlefield. In each case, the innovation was rejected by experts who were applying the lessons of the past to the challenges of the future. They were not wrong about what had worked before. They were wrong about what would work next. The well rod is a reminder that sometimes the most valuable ideas come from people who do not know what is supposed to be impossible. Fleming was not a weapons designer or a military theorist. He was a university student who needed to solve a specific problem and was willing to try a tool that the professionals had already discarded. There is one final detail that most accounts of the well rod have overlooked. In 2007, a historian researching the Danish resistance discovered a set of documents in a private archive that had been sealed since the war. The papers belonged to a woman who had served as a courier for the Copenhagen network, the same woman who would later marry Fleming. Among the letters and photographs was a handwritten note dated May 4th, 1945, the day before liberation. The note described the burial of a weapon beneath the floorboards of a building in the Norbro district. It included precise measurements and landmarks to locate the hiding spot. The historian followed the directions to a building that had been renovated multiple times since the war, but still stood on its original foundations. With permission from the current owners, he arranged for a careful excavation of the area described in the note. Beneath layers of modern flooring and decades of dust, they found the oiled cloth bundle exactly where the note said it would be. Inside was a Welrod Mark II serial number partially worn away. Rubber grip cracked with age, but still intact. The weapon had waited in the darkness for 62 years. The pistol was donated to the Danish Resistance Museum, where it now sits in a climate-controlled display case alongside photographs and documents from the occupation era. Most visitors walk past without giving it much attention. It looks unremarkable, just another piece of old military equipment among hundreds of artifacts. They do not know that this specific tube killed a general in Copenhagen Central Station. They do not know that it was buried by a man who wanted to leave the killing behind when he walked into the light of liberation. They do not know that it represents one of the most successful assassination campaigns in the history of underground warfare. The museum label identifies it simply as a British suppressed pistol used by the Danish resistance. The full story, the story of Fleming and the ghost gun and the silent war that broke the occupation from within that story, is not written on any plaque. We tell these stories because history is not just about the big battles and famous generals. It is about the ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and refused to accept that they were powerless. Fleming was a university student who became an assassin because his country needed ghosts more than soldiers. The engineers who designed the Welrod were tinkerers who built an assassination tool out of plumbing parts because conventional weapons could not do what needed to be done. The resistance fighters who eventually embraced the ugly black tube were men and women who learned to value silence over firepower, because silence was what kept them alive. From a piece of pipe that everyone called a bicycle pump to a weapon that served for 50 years across 6 continents. From a basement full of laughing skeptics to a museum display case honoring the fallen. From a single desperate idea to thousands of lives saved by the fear that idea created in the hearts of occupiers everywhere. That is the power of refusing to accept what the experts say is impossible. The Welrod proved that sometimes the joke weapon changes everything. It proved that courage is not about carrying the biggest gun. It is about carrying the right gun and having the nerve to use it when no one believes it will work. If you know a story like this, an idea that everyone dismissed until it transformed the world, share it in the comments. These hidden chapters of history deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to follow more stories of the innovations and individuals that shaped the wars of the 20th century. There are hundreds of them waiting to be told. The bicycle pump is just the beginning. And remember this. Somewhere in a museum in Copenhagen, an ugly black tube sits in silence. It does not look like a weapon that changed history. It looks like a piece of junk. But that piece of junk is proof that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a bomb or a tank or an army. It is a single person with an impossible idea and the courage to try it anyway.